Costello topped off his inventory at a Smith's in Los Lunas and found a laundromat to wash and dry his clothes. He really has no desire to do any of his errands in Texas or Oklahoma. Some friends who had frequented Texas suggested food spots and dive bars, but unfortunately Chico's Tacos and Pascal Bar were all too far south. As much as he wanted to squeeze the trip for every bit of sightseeing he could do, he was nose to the grindstone and nothing was getting in the way of staying on pace. He felt pretty confident he'd find some celebrated venues up northern Texas. Unfortunately, his first welcoming was two state troopers just west of Groom, September 9th, 2024. Texas had become a bit of a police state during the previous governor's term, and even with the new leadership, law enforcement was still running a slightly separatist posse. The United States were in the wake of a very divisive rhetoric since 2015, and a civil war never officially commenced. However, groups formed enclaves in support of a president who failed to win incumbency. The balance of the Supreme Court shifted in an unfavorable direction of those who were oppressed, disenfranchised, and not radically Christian. Sadly, even with progressive leadership, police and deputies felt largely emboldened to maintain their oaths to a corrupt Supreme Court, rather than the country they swore to protect. It hadn't even crossed Costello's mind he was in possession of a felony's worth of psychedelics in a state where women were being arrested for leaving the state without submitting a pregnancy test. The moment he handed over his California driver license, he watched the demeanors on both troopers turn from inquisitive to ingenious. He just shuddered to think what evil lurked in their minds and how they could fuck with this liberal California snowflake. He dug deep in the archives from his bartending days and remembered two Oklahoma boys who drank every can of domestic beer he had in the bar. They went on to tell Costello about how much Oklahomans despised Texans, and vice versa. When one of the troopers asked Costello what he was doing with his cute little bicycle and trailer up in their panhandle, Costello turned on the charm. He told them he wanted to be one of the few to ever cycle across the entire nation to show his patriotism. Where he really won them over was when he said he charted his path through Oklahoma so he could be sure to take a dump on the 50-yard line at Sooner Stadium. Both troopers reared their heads back in laughter and in unison said, "You're shitting me." Costello said, "No pun intended." He made up a story about having friends from Denton who let him visit from time to time, and he became a Longhorns fan through them. Went on to tell them he was moving the hell out of California as soon as he could because it was going to shit from all the liberal laws. He capped off the encounter taking a selfie with them and both wishing him the best of luck. Costello's takeaway was they weren't so bad, long as you shared ideologies with them. He also realized he better develop a better hiding spot for his stash in case he isn't so lucky next time. The next big push was getting across the northern tip of Texas, into Oklahoma, and straight to Oklahoma City. Costello was ready for a nice big city and a quick break. Grab some good food and a drink or two. Nothing crazy, just enough to recharge and get his ass into Missouri above the Ozark Plateau. However, he would stay low enough to keep along the West Virginia path that would bring him into Pennsylvania. This was a straight shot to the short jump across New York and then his big goal, pedal across all of New Hampshire. His compulsive mind kept driving this home. Part of him was fine with the tenacity, while his net-medicated version of himself really wished he would just shut the fuck up. Wednesday, September 12th, 2024. Costello pulled up next to a sign that read, "Welcome to Sayre, Oklahoma." Texas was quite an experience, and he was ready for his next mission. He had a long FaceTime with Avery on Monday night. She was furious with him. He hadn't been as engaging with her as she'd hoped, and after finding out about his encounter with Texas lawmen, she suddenly started to feel some pessimism creep in. Costello had a great night Sunday after the detention he survived. It was as though it allowed him to realize in the end he would be spilling his guts about a double homicide, so why was he the least bit concerned about a couple of troopers and his little stash of psilocybin? He found himself seeing how people become so predisposed to their behaviors when indoctrinated, or just simply a part of a culture they don't see as alien to most. He knew Texas wasn't entirely conservative and right-wing, But of course, there would be those who will forever covet the generations of inherent racism, and in many cases just an unknowing kinship to a culture far from what Costello believed and supported. He was very much someone who would never push his ideologies on anyone else, and certainly didn't want theirs pushed on him. Sadly, the United States was falling back into the times when rights were far from equal and extremist Christianity filled with dogma was soaring into a fascist type of moral expectancy. The praxis of simply holding one's faith to themselves was much thinner from previous years. The sanctity of privacy was ironically becoming taboo. This realization just kicked the door open for Costello. He felt more at ease about his decision to speak about his involvement in Seattle, regardless of the outcome. He began to ponder ways he could gather everything he'd ever accumulated and find a way to share it with the world as a gift to anyone willing to look toward shaping us into an empathetic and caring amalgamation. Before he busted out of Texas, he found an old Dairy Queen and decided to splurge on hamburgers and ice cream. First, he went into a drugstore for melatonin capsules. He ran across some that worked perfect for his psilocybin. His coffee bean grinder pounded up the stems and caps perfectly. The melatonin wasn't needed, so he opened up the capsules and dumped that shit out. Filled the capsules with his plant medicine and checked that off his list. Then he went on to mow down cheeseburgers in a blizzard. The Texas DQ was without a doubt better than any in California. Costello knew most of Oklahoma was flat, but even so, he was tiring. Instead of trying to make a big push into Oklahoma City, he split the baby and found a motel in Weatherford. He had one of those days where his focus and tenacity began to wear at his core. Seeing these landscapes and encountering folks in these middle America regions started to toy with his logic and sense of duality. He was once again struggling to understand the basic binary structure of good and evil. He met people who he knew he could never share a life with, and it began to break him. He hated this emotion, knowing people are a construct of their environment. They don't all have to become a certain way. Deciding to be pro-life, pro-gun, anti-immigration, etc. isn't objective. These are subjective devices our neighbors, loved ones, politicians, and pastors may or may not impress upon us. The age-old question of whether or not the government is keeping people misinformed and penniless was swallowing Costello. Tomorrow was a big day, and he needed to be ready to push hard into Oklahoma City, but he was crying for answers as to why people, not just in America, had become so fixated on labeling themselves with a political brand. It was especially frustrating when it was dividing people living in a 2 centuries-old democracy. He knew he was fooling himself. Racism has bounced from platform to platform like a goddamn video game character, just to grow its tentacles stronger, all while making people believe there had been progress. All those oppressed were still fighting 4 times harder than everyone else just to gain the same equity, if not less. Our beautiful planet just spins through space carrying all the water. Meanwhile, we abuse its grace by not appreciating each other because our skin color is different, or our voices and words sound different, or heaven forbid, we choose to love someone differently than the Bible says is appropriate. Costello had his first real conversation with his mom about his thoughts on all of this. She dropped everything and told him to take as much time as he needed. He told her there wasn't enough time in the day for him to get all of this out of his head. Then he thanked her for just offering to be a listener. She asked if he'd spoken with Avery. He immediately became inquisitive about why she would ask him about Avery. She knew he was on to her, so she just came clean. She didn't spill all the details, but just enough to feel as though she was being honest. Again, she and Avery felt the tour was most important, and he was damn near to his goal of peddling his original home state. Now wasn't the time to throw him off, at least any more than he seemed to already be based on what he was venting about. Costello asked if he could call her through Oklahoma and then go back to Avery once he got into the Appalachians. He told her about their pre-planning and felt it was important he stay close with Avery during that portion of the tour. He also told Candace about his encounter with the Texas State Troopers. She got quite a kick out of his ruse and said that may be one of her proudest mom moments. They got a good laugh and began their goodbye. Candace opened up a little bit and really emphasized how proud she was with Costello, not just for committing to this insane tour, but his life in general.
He acted as though he wasn't fazed by a word she said and brought up something he'd been needing to tell her.
Costello explained his investment of the money Grands left him and its volume. There'd been a bit of a crypto crash, however. He was so flush, it really hadn't impacted him. He reminded her he had no other beneficiaries, so of course, she was his beneficiary. Quite a conundrum, since she herself was flush from her lawsuits. She assumed he had a plan, so didn't ask any questions. Told him she would do whatever it was he desired, but also insisted none of this would be necessary. Costello told her an estate attorney established the language based on his request, and she would be receiving a package. Candace interrupted and reminded him he had a tour to focus on finishing. He knew that meant she would do exactly what he'd hoped for with the haul of cash. Candace cut him off and asked for photos when he arrives in Oklahoma City. They hung up the phone, and it was as though every bit of existential dread and anxiety had been lifted from his body. He had one of the best night's rest yet.